Aloha and welcome to the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center's An Afternoon with the Author. My name is Deidre Teagarden and we are so thrilled that you have chosen to join us this afternoon. Today we will be hearing from Dr. Gail Okawa. Dr. Gail Okawa is Professor Emerita of English, Youngstown State University, Ohio. Interested in the relationships among language and literacy, culture, and race in historical, political, and educational contexts, she has published articles in national journals and collections and has presented papers and lectures nationally and internationally. As a scholar in residence at the Smithsonian Institute in 2002, she began researching the politics of literacy, identity, and culture among Japanese immigrants from Hawaii, including her maternal grandfather, imprisoned in U.S. Justice War Department internment camps, culminating in Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile, U.S. Imprisonment of Hawaii's Japanese in World War II, published by the University of Hawaii Press 2020. Today, she will be sharing her talk, Mountains of Memory, Depths of Gratitude, Remembering Issei internee fathers and their American military sons. Please help me give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Gail Okawa. Gail, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Deidre. And thanks to the Nisei Vets Memorial Center for the opportunity to share my book with you. Originally, last month in person, and it was really a thrill to be on Maui. It had a lot of personal significance for me because it was my maternal homestead, really. My mother, my grandparents considered it home. Okay, let's try this technology now. My title, Mountains of Memory, Depths of Gratitude, evokes many mountains and deep gratitude, as I hope you will see here. These are the mountains of Italy, which I'll refer to a little bit later on. I'm grateful to speak specifically to honor our American military with stories of World War II. This was around the time of Memorial Day, specifically of the service of the Nisei soldiers who fought in the Pacific and Europe, despite their fathers being imprisoned in Department of Justice camps like the Santa Fe internment camp in New Mexico. So this is dedicated to the memories of all sons and daughters who served and now serve this country, especially to Reverend Yoshiaki Fujitani, who grew up on Maui in Pauwela, served in the MIS during World War II, became a Buddhist minister and bishop in Honolulu, and passed away in May 2021 at age 97. So that was about his 1-year anniversary when I gave the original talk. Much of the material I'll share with you today is based on chapter 7 of my book, Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile. To begin with some context, some of you may know this part of the story, for I told it here before. It focuses on the Issei from Hawaii and how they ended up in prison camps in New Mexico during World War II. This story is unique to my grandfather, Reverend Tamasaku Watanabe, but an example of the choices that immigrants make that influence our lives as descendants, metaphorical mountains of memory. Tamasaku Watanabe had chosen to leave his village in Hiroshima for San Francisco in 1905 at age 22, was baptized as a Christian there, and served as the secretary of the Japanese YMCA, precursor to the Japanese Presbyterian Church. Witnessing the devastation of the great San Francisco earthquake, He'd been inspired to enter a theological seminary in San Francisco to formally join the Christian ministry. He married, started a family in California, and served at two Japanese Christian churches in California, one in Stockton and one in Sacramento. But in the early 1920s, he made another choice: to serve as an evangelist in the Hawaiian Islands. Just as the family was preparing to leave for Hawaii, unfortunately, their youngest child was killed in an accident with an oil truck. Although grieving for this loss, Reverend Watanabe packed up his family, that was grandma and 3 children, and they made the hard voyage, what he called the hard voyage, across the ocean a few weeks later. He was first assigned to Maui, where he served at the Wailuku Japanese Christian Church, now Iao United Church of Christ, for 13 years. And there he is smiling in the top row. Then was transferred to serve plantation workers in Ola on the Big Island in 1935. Nearly 20 years after his chosen but, quote, hard voyage, unquote, to the islands, his notes show that he was arrested in his parsonage on December 7th, 1941, that fateful Sunday, and imprisoned by the US Justice and War Departments in 5 camps, which are listed here, if you can read his writing, from that day until November 13th, 1945, when he returned to Hawaii from the Santa Fe internment camp. He'd been imprisoned for nearly 4 years for being Japanese, since he was never charged with a crime. The warrant, as you can see, states arrest on suspicion of being an alien enemy of the US. Now that sounds ominous, but was merely an immigration status. According to the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, so this is an 18th century law, the status of nationals of an enemy country automatically changes from alien to alien enemy upon the declaration of war. Since laws outlawed the Japanese from becoming citizens, unlike Germans and Italians, they had no choice. So he was imprisoned in Hawaii from December 7th. He was sent from Kilauea military camp on the Big Island to the immigration station on Oahu, and then to the Sand Island internment camp, then exiled thousands of miles away to the mainland on this path on the top map, from Honolulu to Fort McDowell or Angel Island in San Francisco Bay, to Fort Sam Houston, to Camp Wardsburg, to Santa Fe. This gives you some idea of what these places looked like. This was Fort Sam Houston, where they were for 10 days. In the upper left-hand corner, about 6 rows of tents. They were sent after 10 days to Lordsburg when the Army changed its mind. And they were there for about a year. We don't have photos of Lordsburg, but we do have sketches from George Hoshida, who was from the Big Island. His entire collection is in the Japanese American National Museum. And then they were sent and were 2.5 years at the Santa Fe internment camp. This is a painting by Reverend Gyokue Matsuura. This was run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service and the Border Patrol, and they were there from June 23rd, 1943 to October 30th, 1945. Not until 40 years later did Congress pass the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, apologizing for the causes of this injustice. Racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Reverend Watanabe was one of hundreds of Issei men from Hawaii, one of thousands from the entire US, many leaders in their Japanese communities who were imprisoned by an agreement set up between the Department of Justice and the War Department in July 1941. So this was 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The government was making plans and was prepared. While interned, he belonged in many ways to different groups of men. Those exiled from Hawaii to the mainland on Transfer Boat 3, departing in May 1942 for Angel Island, California, was one of the main groups. Here he is in the second row. Now, this group was in many ways a microcosm of the whole. In this photo are at least one Buddhist minister, a Shinto priest, a coffee farmer, 2 Japanese school principals, a businessman, an attorney, a plantation worker who was also active with his children's PTA, a shopkeeper, and himself a Christian minister. Now, this is just to my knowledge, gathered from different interviews. There were 10 transfer boats from Hawaii to California. And the lower map shows 4 of the main routes that I was able to identify. Nearly 700 men from Hawaii were sent to different camps according to boat load. And I'm still learning about other routes and other men. Collecting stories, I learned that at least 5 of these men on my grandfather's transfer boat had sons or a grandson in the US military while they were locked up. Reverend Fujitani, Mr. Ohama, and Mr. Mizutari had sons in the military intelligence service in the Pacific. And Reverend Ikuma had a grandson in the 100th Battalion. Mr. Nakagawa, I'm just learning about, and we're trying to identify his son's unit. The other very important group, of course, consisted of those who lived with Reverend Watanabe in Barrack 64, including another Japanese school principal. This is my grandfather. This is the Japanese school principal, Mr. Maihara, who had 2 sons in the military. Mr. Nagami, who had 2 sons. Mr. Izutsu, who had 1. And Mr. Yoshimatsu, who had 2 sons. There was also Mr. Hota, but I don't have a photo of him. He had 2 sons also in the US military. So Reverend Watanabe and his fellow internees witnessed the pride, apprehension, and anguish of those fathers whose sons were serving in the Pacific and Europe. They bore witness to this irony, one among which what I call compounded ironies. So this is irony 1. The sons served in the military while their fathers were locked up. And I'm sure you're familiar with these different units, but I'll mention them. The 100th Infantry Battalion, which fought in North Africa, Italy, and France. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which fought in the European front in Italy and France. And the MIS, the Military Intelligence Service, which was in the Pacific, Burma, the Pacific Islands, Okinawa, and occupied Japan. Now, how did this first irony become clear? I spent months at the National Archives digging through endless file boxes and came across a document, a list titled Japanese Civilian Internees from Hawaii with Sons in the Armed Forces of the United States. The government recorded the irony and the injustice in black and white. I remember being stunned, saddened, and angered all at the same time. This is an 11-page list of names of internees with sons serving in the US military while their fathers were locked up. Some sons were drafted, many volunteered, despite and perhaps because of the intense racial prejudice of the time. As I pointed out before, with Mr. Maihara and Mr. Nagami, there were 2 sons. In more than rare cases, there were 3 and 4 sons in the military service by June 1945, when the list was revised. This is a total of 210 sons and 161 interned fathers from Hawaii alone. And there were many others of mainland Japanese families enlisted from the WRA camps where they themselves were imprisoned. Why and how did the government officials become aware of this irony in the first place? Because a son, Robert S. Miyata, a private from Hawaii in Company G 442, wrote a letter. And this is a very interesting story of advocacy and literacy. I'm sorry I don't have time to go into the details, but it is written up in my book. Irony 2. In my research, I began to realize another irony expressed in this poem by Otokichi Muin Ozaki. The interned fathers and military sons physically crossed paths. Sailing on separate decks, the son, a US soldier, his father, a prisoner of war. In some cases, they were on the same ship, so literally and also figuratively. They were also, in some cases, in the same camp. The internees in Transfer Boat 1 were sent to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, in February 1942, as you will find, and the 100th Battalion was secretly sent there for combat training weeks after the fathers were sent to another camp. So they were really ships passing in the night. And there's irony 3. As I interviewed some of the veteran sons, many in their 80s, whose fathers had been imprisoned, I learned that it was precisely because those young men, all US born, and in their late teens or early 20s, had been shipped from Hawaii to the mainland for their military training, that some were also able to visit their immigrant fathers exiled to the mainland internment camps, an improbability under other circumstances, both for economic reasons and political reasons. Even those who may have had distant or strained relationships with their fathers before the war made the effort, reflecting their respect for one another and illustrating the power of filial piety, or oyakoko in Japanese, over difficult relationships. Some visited their fathers in Camp Livingston, Louisiana, and here's one example. Hideo Tokairin, on the right, was drafted in June 1941 into the 298th Infantry Regiment, which eventually combined into the 100th Battalion. His father, Jinshichi, was a small hotel owner and community leader. He'd been arrested on December 7th and exiled from Hawaii in February 1942 by way of Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. In June 1942, For June 1942, Hideo's unit was secretly shipped out to the mainland to train at Camp McCoy. So he unknowingly crossed paths with his father. Although Hideo was not particularly close to his father, he told me in an interview that he felt sorry for him being unjustly imprisoned. So in early May 1943, he made the trip by train from Wisconsin to Camp Livingston, Louisiana. That's all the way across the country. This treasured family photo shows the two men standing side by side with pine trees in the background. And in a letter to his wife, the elder Tokaiden expresses his joy over his son's visit. Yesterday, Hideo unexpectedly visited me, but stayed for only 3 hours. He received a short break during maneuvers and came to see me. He was very happy when I gave him some of the Japanese pickles you had sent. Hideo seemed to be in good health. He wore 3 medals on his chest and looked great as a soldier. On June 1st, 1943, Hideo visited his father again, this time from Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where the 100th Battalion had been transferred for a further training. This time, PFC Tokaiden persuaded his father against repatriating to Japan, then shipped out to North Africa and to Salerno, Italy, where he was wounded and earned a Purple Heart and Bronze Star in Italy. Because many internees were incarcerated for longer periods at the Santa Fe internment camp than anywhere else, some sons made their way to the high desert from Army camps like Camp Shelby and the language training school for the Military Intelligence Service at Fort Snelling, Minnesota. So one example is that of the Fujitanis. In June 1944, Private Yoshiaki Fujitani was stationed at Fort Snelling, Minnesota for military intelligence training at the MIS language school. Although upset that his father had been interned, he had volunteered to serve in the MIS at age 20. His father, Reverend Kodo Fujitani, a Buddhist minister, had been shipped on Transfer Boat 3 along with my grandfather, and in Santa Fe since June 1943. On his first furlough, Yoshiaki decided to visit his father, whom he found behind a high barbed wire fence. He describes it as an incongruous scene. A son in the US Army meets his father, who is suspected by the government of being a potentially dangerous enemy. He was dressed in a tan suit, sporting a goatee. It touched me to think that he felt he had to be dressed in a formal way to greet his son, who was serving in the US Army. So they had a quiet visit. At one point, the father and son stood and had this picture taken by a photographer with the familiar juniper dotted hillside of Santa Fe behind the camp in the background. Decades later, the son wrote of the photograph. To the casual viewer, it must be an uninteresting photo of 2 rather grim gentlemen. But for me, it has a very special meaning. It has a very special meaning since it is a souvenir photo of my dad and myself taken right outside the barbed wire fence of the camp in Santa Fe. That picture serves as a reminder of an intensely emotional moment in my life when I traveled hundreds of miles from Minnesota to meet my father after a separation of 2 years. About a year before that picture was taken, I had written a letter to my father from Hawaii, expressing hope that since we were not very close and unable to sit down and have a good heart-to-heart talk in the past, the next time we meet, we ought to do that over a bottle of beer or 2. which obviously was just a 19-year-old son talking big to the father he missed. When the meeting finally did occur, all the bravado and confidence deserted me, and all I could muster was, "Dad, how are you?" There was nothing else that could be said at that time. It doesn't show in our faces, but I know that we were happy to see each other, and I'm sure Dad felt very proud standing next to his American soldier son in his buck private's uniform. In many ways, I feel that the gravest irony, having the greatest poignancy, has to do with the sons being killed in action, fighting for the country which had unjustly imprisoned their fathers. First, I read in my grandfather's notes that several sons of his barrack mates had been killed or seriously wounded in action. And I also noted that this government document lists 7 Hawaii internee sons who had died in combat in Europe and the Pacific by June 1945. And you can see an example that's highlighted there in blue. Just among my grandfather's associates, there were 4. Mr. Mizutari, who was on the transfer boat, on the same transfer boat, lost his son in the Pacific War. And this is a long story in my book. And 3 of Reverend Watanabe's barrack mates, Mr. Hota, whom I don't have a photo of, Mr. Nagami, and Mr. Maihara, each lost a son fighting with the 100th 442 in Italy. In chapter 7, I write, making this observation, realizing how the loss of the imprisoned fathers compounded the harsh irony of their imprisonment, I felt moved to learn and in some way to relate these stories in commemoration of the sacrifices of both the fathers and the sons. I've listed all 7 here. PFC Arthur Akito Morihara, Technical Sergeant Yukitaka Terry Mizutari, Staff Sergeant Toshio Murakami, Private First Class Kihachiro Hota, Sergeant Hiroshi Nagami, Private First Class Iwa Blondie Takemoto, and First Lieutenant Saburo Maehara. Due to time limits, I will focus on 4 of them who fought in Italy and France. What the imprisoned fathers may not have known was when and where their sons died. Somehow, the losses of the fathers and the injustice of their imprisonment seemed to me most acute in those moments. And these stories touched me deeply. So deeply, in fact, that I got my knees replaced and joined 3 tour groups to Italy and France in 2019 to follow some of the World War II battle paths with families and friends of the Nisei soldiers. Mountains of memory. So I'll provide here brief biographical and historical sketches for the son sacrifices, focusing on Maui's sons, with thanks to David Fukuda, who was on one of the tours with me. Toshio Murakami was born in Wailuku and educated in the local public schools before serving as a defense worker on Maui. His sister Hazel, who was 5 years younger, idolized him and remembers that he called her sweetheart and gorgeous to make her feel good. Toshio was probably drafted before December 7th, 1941, as he was inducted into the army in Wailuku in February 1942, after the ban against Nisei enlistment had gone into effect. He was 22. His father, Shigeru, owned a local billiard parlor and served as the secretary treasurer of the Wailuku Honganji before he was arrested, imprisoned at Haiku, and sent to Sand Island internment camp, and then to the mainland months later in October 1942 on the 7th transfer boat. He ended up with my grandfather and hundreds of other Hawaii Issei in Lordsburg, New Mexico. Toshio was eventually assigned to Company A of the 100th and sent to Camp McCoy and Camp Shelby for advanced combat training. His sister shared the poignant fact that Toshio had visited his father before being shipped overseas. So I believe in Santa Fe, meaning that Shigeru was the last family member to see him alive. After completing combat training in the States, Toshio was sent overseas to Algeria and subsequently participated in the landing at Salerno and the Italian campaign. Kihachiro Hota, one of the sons mentioned by my grandfather in his notebook, was probably among the 442 volunteers. Like Murakami, he was also from Wailuku and was described by his younger brother Shoma as tall and husky and recruited to play football at Lahaina Luna High School, a boarding school. A boyhood friend remembers Kihachiro as a true gentleman. His father, Kyoji, had fought as a corporal in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 05 before leaving for the islands, when the family farm went to his eldest brother. He began peddling various goods at the Japanese camps on Maui, and later in Wailuku opened a store that sold fine items such as felt hats and silk stockings. He was arrested on April 2nd, 1942. Before entering the service, Kihachiro worked as a clerk in the family's Hota store, which my mother remembered from her childhood in Wailuku. He was inducted into the Army in March 1943 at Schofield Barracks. Serving with the 100th Battalion C Company, Kihachiro trained at Camp Shelby and stopped in Santa Fe to visit his father before being shipped overseas with the 442 replacements. You can see him here, his father standing between the two men in uniform. I believe the second person is the one on the right is his brother. The only native of the island of Kauai among the 7 sons was Iwao Blondie Takemoto, who was born and attended public schools there. He was employed as a welder for the Army prior to volunteering for military service. Inducted in March 1943, he trained at Camp Shelby in the 442 K Company, 3rd Battalion, and served in Italy and France. The last of the 7 sons of Hawaii internees killed in action was actually the first to serve in the military. Saburo Maehara was also from Maui, the 3rd son of Teichiro Maehara, a Japanese language school principal, was my grandfather's barrack mate and friend. Saburo attended public schools on Maui, as well as the University of Hawaii on Oahu. Having participated in the university's Army ROTC program, he received a 2nd lieutenant's commission in June 1936 upon graduating from the university. He became a public school teacher, an agricultural instructor at a Maui high school, and in May 1941 married Louise Sasai. They had a daughter, Susan. In an interview in 2008, Lieutenant Maehara's brother-in-law, Sam Sasai, told me that Saburo was, quote, a very caring teacher, interested in his students being successful, unquote. His younger siblings looked up to him and considered him a leader. And according to Issei, who also served with the 442, Saburo looked out for him at the battlefront. His not being called to active duty until March 1943 placed Lieutenant Maehara with the 100th 442 after they merged. Being commissioned as a second lieutenant, he was rightfully among the officers of the 442. The majority of them were Caucasian, but it had been over 6 years since he had been commissioned. When the 442 arrived for training at Camp Shelby, he was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia for officers training. The 100th left the 442nd Troops still training at Camp Shelby in August 1943 and entered combat in September 1943 in the south of Italy. And you can see here where they entered below Salerno, moving towards Cassino. The first internee son killed in action was PFC Arthur Akito Morihara. When in October 1943, A Company was a part of what war correspondent Lynn Crost describes as the, quote, fight to capture the small towns of Alife and San Angelo de Alife, where they were stopped by enemy tanks. According to Crost, this, quote, involved some of the most difficult fighting of the war. In the village town of San Angelo de Alife, on this trip that I took, this tour that I took in 2019, we found this monument dedicated to those in the 34th Division who died in that fighting. As you can see, it's dedicated to the memory of the 59 American soldiers who died in the Battle of San Angelo de Alife during World War II. The infamous battle at Cassino in January 1944 was so devastating that the ranks of the 100th Battalion, which was over strength with 5 infantry companies to the normal 3 companies, were depleted by the time it was withdrawn from Cassino. So the 1st Battalion over the 442, still in training at Camp Shelby, had to be rushed to the 100th at Anzio as replacements. Lieutenant Maehara was sent into battle with these replacements. And I just wanted to note, for those of you who may not know this, the 100th was absorbed into the 442nd Regimental Combat Team as its 1st Battalion, and by presidential dispensation was allowed to retain the designation 100th Battalion for demonstrated valor. As some of you know, this was a designation originally foisted on them because they were an orphaned unit, welcomed only by Lieutenant General Mark Clark of the 5th Army. Having started at Anzio with the 100th, Lieutenant Maehara was there when the 442 arrived north of Rome in June 1944. The 442nd's initial battle was at Subareto Belvedere. And you can see on the map in the lower right-hand corner where that was located. And although the 2nd and 3rd Battalions had typical initiation problems starting into combat, the 100th showed off its experience by skillful maneuvers and earned a presidential unit citation for what Lynn Crost calls its brilliant performance. As the 34th Division drove the Germans north, the 442 would have arrived to cross the Cecina River, which is marked for you in blue there. It is north of that river that the Germans decided to make a stand to delay the Allied advance. And it is in this area that Staff Sergeant Murakami, PFC Hota, and Sergeant Nagani were killed during the Rome-Arno campaign on July 9th, 10th, and 12th, respectively. In September 1944, the 100th 442 was secretly transferred from Italy to the south of France. And PFC Takemoto and K Company, 3rd Battalion, as well as the 100th and 2nd Battalions, were engaged in the liberation of French villages like Bruyères and Bifontaine, and the now famous rescue of the Lost Battalion, the Texas unit trapped in the Vosges Mountains. You can see in the lower right-hand corner where the Lost Battalion was and the path that the different battalions had to take in order to rescue them. It was somewhere in the hills and mountains approaching the entrapped unit where PFC Takemoto was wounded and died on October 28th, 1944. The very next day, October 29th, the 3rd and 100th Battalions fought the bloodiest battle of that effort, and pardon my French pronunciation, at La Croisette Junction, charging against enemy automatic fire and hand grenades to rescue the Texans. PFC Takemoto was among the extraordinary number of over 2,000 Japanese American troops killed or wounded to save 280 Texans. Mountains of Memory. We were there in the Vosges to see the remnants of the foxholes in the once treacherous forests and to participate in a ceremony honoring the heroism of the Nisei troops in the rescue. First Lieutenant Maehara was the oldest of the 7 sons of Hawaii internees, and the last among them to give his life in combat when he died on his 30th birthday, April 5th, 1945, in Italy during the Po Valley campaign. That day was the beginning of the 442's final campaign, the breach of the Gothic Line. Gothic Line referring to the German defenses. This was from April 5th to May 8th, 1945. As with many battles, success may be achieved by the sacrifice of the diversionary units that distract the enemy's attention from the main objective. That was the role of the 100th Battalion. You can see here that Mount Fogarito is in the lower right-hand corner in yellow, and the 100th Battalion was advancing below it. From early on April 5th, the 100th had started its climbing attack of the hills toward Mount Fogarito. The Germans were focused on the 100th, and in that battle, First Lieutenant Maehara was killed near Ripa, Italy, by a German mortar shell, according to Colonel Virgil Miller. The actual breach of the Gothic Line occurred the following day, April 6th, and is physically the most dramatic of the 442's battles. Nisei troops had to climb the formidable cliff fronting Mount Fogarito. And they did it at night in full gear and carrying extra ammunition. And they did it instructed not to utter a sound if they should lose their footing and fall. And a few did fall without uttering a sound. Early the next morning, they surmounted the cliff, surprised 8 sleeping Germans, and took them prisoner. And by shortly after noon, they had captured the German observation post at the summit of Mount Fogarito. One of the traveling companions, only one of our traveling companions, actually was able to climb up to the top of Mount Fulgarito and took this photo. So you can see the incredible mountainous nature of Italy. This action eliminated the artillery threat in that area and was strategic in ending war in Europe. Military historian Eric Saul has reported that the 100th 442 did in 30 minutes what 30,000 people could not do in 6 months. So the Nisei distinguished themselves, as we know. The 100th became known as the Purple Heart Battalion because of its heavy losses at Cassino and so in other battles. The 442nd became the most highly decorated unit in military history for its size and length of service. This was, of course, the 100th 442. And the Military Intelligence Service is said to have shortened the war in the Pacific by 2 years and saved thousands of lives. In prison camps, thousands of miles away in Santa Fe, New Mexico, these young soldiers were not only the sons of their fathers, but also of communities of men in camp society. Their fathers' friends, men from their hometowns, they had communities of fathers. Many photos of the son's visit show the soldier's son in uniform, surrounded by men of the Kohala Kona community, or Kauai men. One rare, rather startling photo pictures nine unidentified Nisei soldiers sitting in a row in dress uniforms, their buttons aligned, with a large group of internees standing in the snow behind them. The snow-covered brush suggests that this was a Santa Fe winter. And when a son died, there was a community loss. Theirs was a community loss, a shared sorrow. In his memoir, journalist Yasutaro Soga records the Buddhist memorial service for PFC Arthur Akira Morihara of the 100th Battalion, the first soldier son of Hawaii, of a Hawaii internee to be killed in action. He writes, on December 9th, 1943, it snowed heavily all day. It was the 49th day after the death in Italy of Mr. Akira Morihara, the third son of Mr. Usako Morihara, a shop owner from Kona. A memorial service was held at the Lower Town Mess Hall in the afternoon, and many internees attended. This was the first service in the camp for a fallen Japanese American soldier. On December 10th, 1943, Issei Kato, who was from Kona, like the Moriharas, wrote a more personal letter home about Akira Morihara's death. He writes, today is Akira's 48th Memorial Day. Kona friends held a memorial service for him. From early morning, it has snowed heavily, so we had a very cold, quiet, and solemn service. His papa, who had drained his strength and spirit, now seems to have settled some. We do what we can to console him, but nothing we can say or do is that uplifting. It's so very pitiful. How can one understand the loss of a son in battle and the father imprisoned? But these services were very often multi-faith in the sense that we have Reverend Fujitani in the back as one of the people officiating in the service, and my grandfather, Christian ministers, attending as a member of the Japanese community. And on the same topic, Soga mentions another service. He writes, on the night of the 13th of December, 1943, internees from Maui held a memorial service for 8 Japanese American soldiers from Maui who had been killed in Italy. The Reverends Ryugen Matsuda and Tamasaku Watanabe delivered sermons, and Mr. Tokiji Takei said a few words on behalf of the families. It was later reported that of Japanese American soldiers from Maui, 8 had been killed and 180 injured. In December 1943, these Nisei soldiers killed and wounded in action must have referred primarily to members of the 100th Battalion, who were among the first Nisei troops deployed to Europe. So Reverend Watanabe, my grandfather, was not at all a stranger to this loss, but must have felt it deeply, especially since he spoke at the service, having had a long 13-year ministry on Maui, and may have known some of the young men. So, mountains of memory, depths of gratitude, depths of our gratitude as descendants. The first mountains are those in New Mexico. The first mountains are those in New Mexico that the Issei saw daily and painted. Memories evoked for them, such as the paintings, these paintings from Mr. Tokaiden and Reverend Matsuura. Our memories and gratitude go to them who withstood the injustice and the insult, survived their incarceration with dignity, and returned to their lives to allow for ours, our fathers and grandfathers. The second mountains are the metaphorical mountains of distrust and prejudice that the Nisei soldiers had to surmount in the military and US society, thereby creating a different environment for their American Japanese families. And of course, the literal mountains of France and Italy, where they fought to liberate the French and Italian villagers who have not forgotten them. Lieutenant Maehara's death was a sacrifice, part of the sacrifice to allow the surprise breach of the Gothic line. But the deaths of each of the men of the 100th, 442, and MIS were sacrifices for their families and loved ones, for all American Japanese who would follow them, for their country. The sons must be and are being remembered. Here is the memorial on Mount Fogarito. Ed Sakota, the sole member of our group that reached the top, left this note. Thank you for remembering our fathers. This is from the families. Sadao Munemori is memorialized in Pietrasanta, Italy. He was in the 100th Battalion and died on the same day in the same attack as Saburo Maehara. Sadao Munemori was the first Nisei to receive the Medal of Honor, until 20 others who had been overlooked were upgraded due to American politics, of course. And their grave sites, different memorials. This is in Punchbowl National Cemetery of the Pacific from the village of Bifontaine. In October 1944, the 442 wrote the word liberty with their blood. Bifontaine remembers. Such memorials represent the hope that American soldiers like the Nisei brought to the people they liberated. A great irony because their fathers and relatives may have been locked up behind barbed wire in the US. So their Issei fathers' imprisonment must also be remembered. A reminder of the imperfections and struggles in forming a more perfect union. memorialized here in the Santa Fe internment camp marker. We just commemorated the 20th anniversary of establishing that marker so that we don't forget. Our memories and gratitude must thus reflect the depth and complexity of historical moments. We, as those they left behind, must never forget the fragility of the liberty that the Nisei fought for and the constant vigilance we must maintain to protect it. Thank you.
Gail, thank you so much for your research, for putting this together, and for sharing such personal stories about a time that, as you state, we must never forget, we must never repeat. We want to thank you very, very much.
Thank you again for the opportunity. It was a real pleasure to join you on Maui and to do this over again.
Yes. Twice is a charm.
Right.
Or something along those lines. But this is wonderful because it will really allow those who were not here in person at your talk and book signing to get a much better view of your PowerPoint presentation. And for those who are watching this on our YouTube channel, if you are interested in Gail's book, we do have a handful of copies here available at the Nisei Veterans Memorial Center. So you can please get in touch with us and we can get you those books. But again, Gail, thank you so much. I just want to leave you with some, let you share some closing remarks if you would like.
Well, I just want to remind folks that this history of the Issei is something that we really must not forget. It is a part of our story, not only as the Japanese American descendant group, but also of the general American story. It is a very important reminder to us about how we treat our immigrants and how we can be successful in accepting a multicultural society. So thank you very much. And I wish you aloha.